Hello everyone and God bless you. Welcome to the amazing Bible story of one of the bravest women in the Bible. This is the story of the courage of Queen Esther, told in a way to help you drift off into peaceful sleep. Before we begin, I thought it would be a fun idea if you could leave a comment below to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also remember to like the video and subscribe if you want to hear more like this. Okay, let's get comfy, relaxed, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Esther's Rise to the Palace. In the vast and sprawling kingdom of Persia, ruled by King Xerxes, a new chapter was unfolding. A chapter that would shape history and change lives. The capital city of Susa buzzed with life, its streets lined with traders and artisans, the aroma of spices wafting through the air. But within the grandeur of the royal palace, there was a quiet shift of destiny. A new queen was being sought. Esther, a young Jewish woman of humble beginnings, lived in the shadow of the palace walls. She was not born into wealth or privilege but raised with love and wisdom by her cousin Mordecai, who had taken her in as his own daughter after the loss of her parents. Mordecai, a man of deep faith, taught Esther the stories of their ancestors and the importance of trusting in God's plan, no matter how uncertain the path might seem. Esther's days were simple. She would rise early to help with household tasks, her hands skilled at weaving and her voice soft as she recited prayers. But beneath her modest exterior was a quiet strength and grace that caught the attention of everyone who met her. She carried herself with dignity, her heart full of kindness, and her faith unwavering. One day, an unexpected summons rippled through the city. King Xerxes had decreed that young women from across the empire be brought to the palace. The queen, Vashti, had been removed from her position, and now the king sought a new queen to stand by his side. Messengers moved through the streets, knocking on doors and delivering the royal order. Mordecai's home was no exception. The news stirred a mix of emotions within Esther. She had never aspired to royalty, content with her quiet life. But Mordecai saw the hand of providence at work. "Perhaps this is a door being opened by God," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "You must go, Esther. Trust that whatever lies ahead, God will be with you." Esther was taken to the palace along with many other young women. The journey through the gates of Susa and into the opulent halls of the royal complex was overwhelming. Gold adorned the walls, intricate tapestries hung from high ceilings, and servants moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Esther felt like a small thread in a vast, glittering tapestry, but she carried Mordecai's words in her heart, drawing courage from them. Once inside, the young women underwent months of preparation before they could even approach the king. They were bathed in fragrant oils, adorned with fine garments, and taught the customs of the court. But it wasn't Esther's outward beauty that set her apart. It was her inner light, a quiet confidence that shone through her every action. Those who met her, from the attendants to the officials, found themselves drawn to her warmth and sincerity. When the day came for Esther to be presented to King Xerxes, she walked into the throne room with a calm demeanor, her heart lifted in silent prayer. The king, seated on his majestic throne, surrounded by advisors and courtiers, looked upon her with favor. Her presence was different, unassuming yet captivating. Xerxes was immediately drawn to her and chose her to be his queen. As Esther was crowned, she felt the weight of the moment, not just the physical crown but the responsibility it represented. Though she now lived within the marble halls of the palace, with servants at her call and fine jewels at her disposal, she did not forget who she was. She remained deeply connected to her roots and her faith, even as she took her place beside the most powerful man in the land. Mordecai visited Esther when he could, always careful to remind her to keep her Jewish identity a secret, for their people were a minority in Persia, and the times were uncertain. Esther heeded his advice, understanding the wisdom in his words. She continued to pray quietly in the stillness of her chambers, seeking guidance for the road ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Esther began to see that her position as queen was not an end but a beginning. She had been placed in the palace for a purpose, though she could not yet see what it was. And while she enjoyed moments of peace within the lush gardens and serene courtyards, A sense of expectancy lingered in her heart, as if God were preparing her for something far greater than she could imagine. Beyond the palace walls, life in Persia went on, bustling and vibrant. Yet a shadow was beginning to grow, a shadow of a plot that would test Esther's courage and faith in ways she could never have foreseen. For now, though, she rested in the knowledge that she was where she was meant to be, trusting that when the time came, she would find the strength to rise to the moment. And so, the young Jewish girl who had once lived in obscurity now stood at the center of the greatest empire in the world. Esther's journey to the palace was complete, but her true story was only beginning. A story of courage, faith, and the unfolding of God's plan in the most unexpected of ways. Chapter 2: Haman's Dark Plot. The days in the palace were filled with opulence and grandeur, but not all who walked its halls harbored noble intentions. Haman, one of King Xerxes' most trusted advisors, had risen to a position of great power and influence. Draped in the finest silks, with jewels glittering on his fingers, Haman exuded an air of authority that made courtiers bow deeply in his presence. Yet behind his polished exterior lay a heart consumed by pride and ambition, traits that would soon lead him down a dark and dangerous path. Haman reveled in the reverence he commanded. Whenever he entered the city gates or the royal court, people lowered their eyes and bowed low, acknowledging his high rank. All but one, Mordecai, the Jewish man who sat at the gate, steadfastly refusing to bow. Mordecai's quiet defiance gnawed at Haman's ego, turning what should have been a minor slight into a festering wound of resentment. Each time he passed Mordecai, standing tall and unyielding, Haman's fury deepened. At first, Haman tried to dismiss Mordecai as insignificant, but over time, the seed of anger grew into a consuming obsession. To Haman, Mordecai was not just a man. He became a symbol of defiance against Haman's authority. One day, as he returned to his home, the rage finally boiled over. Surrounded by wealth and servants, Haman's mood remained dark. "What use is all my power," he spat, "when that man refuses to honor me?" It wasn't enough to punish Mordecai alone. Haman's wounded pride demanded a far more dramatic response. Mordecai was a Jew, and Haman saw an opportunity to rid the empire of not just one man, but an entire people. The idea took root in his mind, a plan so cruel it would send shockwaves through the kingdom. Haman went to King Xerxes, a master manipulator in his approach. Draping himself in false concern for the kingdom's well-being, he spoke of a people scattered across the empire who, he claimed, refused to follow the king's laws. "They are different from us, your majesty," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Their customs set them apart, and their defiance is a threat to your rule. Allow me to issue a decree, and I will ensure that this problem is eliminated, for the good of the kingdom." King Xerxes, trusting Haman implicitly and unaware of the deeper malice behind his words, gave his consent. He handed Haman his signet ring, a symbol of royal authority, and told him, "Do as you see fit." With the ring in hand, Haman wasted no time drafting the decree. Copies were sent to every corner of the vast empire, instructing officials to destroy all the Jews, young and old, men and women, on a single day. The date was set, and the proclamation sealed with the king's authority. As the edict spread, panic rippled through the Jewish communities. Families read the words with trembling hands, their hearts heavy with fear. How could this happen? They had lived peacefully among their neighbors, contributing to the life of the empire. Now, without warning, they faced the prospect of annihilation. Back in Susa, Mordecai's grief was profound. He tore his garments, a traditional sign of mourning, and put on sackcloth. He sat at the gates, weeping openly, his cries a poignant reminder of the terror that had descended upon his people. Other Jews in the city followed suit, fasting and praying as they grappled with the gravity of their situation. Inside the palace, Esther was initially unaware of the decree. Separated from the outside world by the layers of luxury and protocol, she lived in a kind of gilded isolation. But when word of Mordecai's distress reached her, she sent a messenger to learn what had happened. The messenger returned with a copy of the decree and a plea from Mordecai. Esther must act. She was the queen, and perhaps she had been placed in this position for such a time as this. The news struck Esther like a physical blow. Her heart ached for her people, yet fear gripped her as she considered Mordecai's request. Approaching the king uninvited was a perilous act, punishable by death unless the king extended his golden scepter. Could she truly risk her life for her people? Questions swirled in her mind as she paced her chambers, her usually serene demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. Meanwhile, Haman was reveling in his apparent triumph. He hosted banquets, confident that his plan would soon come to fruition. Each time he passed Mordecai at the gate, he felt a twisted satisfaction, knowing that the man's days were numbered. But Haman's pride blinded him to the larger forces at work, forces that would soon challenge his plans and expose the depth of his cruelty. In the shadows of the palace, a quiet resolve was beginning to form. Esther, though frightened, could feel the weight of destiny pressing upon her. She was no longer just a young woman from humble beginnings. She was the Queen of Persia, with a unique position to influence the course of history. And though the path ahead was uncertain, her faith whispered that she was not alone. As the sun set over the city of Susa, casting long shadows across its bustling streets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the courage and faith of all involved. Esther's heart was heavy, but within that weight, she found a flicker of determination. The time for decisions was drawing near, and the young queen would soon be called upon to rise above her fears and step into her purpose. Chapter 3: Mordecai's Plea to Esther. The days following the decree's announcement were shrouded in sorrow for the Jewish community. Streets once filled with lively chatter became silent as whispers of dread spread through the city. In every home, families huddled together, their hearts heavy with fear for the future. Among the mourners was Mordecai, who had always been a pillar of strength in his community. Now he was broken-hearted, a man grappling with the enormity of the crisis bearing down upon his people. Mordecai's deep grief was evident. Clad in sackcloth and ashes, he stood at the palace gates, his posture a mix of despair and defiance. Though palace protocol forbade anyone in mourning attire from entering, Mordecai's presence was impossible to ignore. Servants and officials passed him, some averting their eyes, while others paused briefly, perhaps to offer a silent prayer. His grief became a visual reminder of the suffering now permeating the Jewish community. Inside the palace, Esther remained unaware of the unfolding tragedy. Shielded by the luxury and routines of royal life, she was isolated from the fears gripping her people. But when news of Mordecai's actions reached her, concern blossomed in her heart. Why was her cousin, the man who had raised her as his own, in such a state of public mourning? Determined to understand, she sent one of the king's trusted eunuchs, Hathach, to inquire about Mordecai's distress. Hathach returned with news that shook Esther to her core. Mordecai had shared the details of the decree and its horrifying implications. He even sent her a copy of the proclamation, its cruel words stark against the fine parchment. In his message, Mordecai pleaded with Esther to act, urging her to go before the king and beg for mercy on behalf of her people. But Esther's heart was torn. The weight of Mordecai's request was immense. She knew the Persian court's strict laws well. Anyone who approached the king uninvited faced death unless the king extended his golden scepter in favor. Even as queen, Esther had no assurance of safety. The thought of confronting the king filled her with trepidation. She had not been summoned to his presence for over a month, a clear indication of her precarious standing. Could she truly risk her life for this cause? Esther sent Hathach back to Mordecai with her reply. She explained the danger she faced and the laws that bound her. Her message was candid, a mixture of fear and doubt. "I cannot simply approach the king," she wrote. "To do so unbidden is to invite death. What power do I truly hold in this palace?" When Mordecai received her response, his reply was firm, yet filled with the urgency of their people's plight. Through Hathach, he reminded Esther of her unique position and the responsibilities it carried. "Do not think that because you live in the king's house, you alone will escape. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. These words struck a chord deep within Esther. Mordecai's faith in God's provision and his belief in her destiny began to chip away at her fear. She paced her chambers, her mind racing. The weight of Mordecai's plea pressed heavily upon her. Each step brought flashes of memory. Her humble beginnings as an orphan, the care and guidance of Mordecai, and the unexpected journey that had brought her to the palace. Was this truly her purpose? Had she been placed in the king's court not for her own comfort, but to be a voice for her people? As the hours passed, Esther's resolve began to take shape. The fear that had once paralyzed her started to give way to a quiet strength. She was still frightened, but alongside that fear grew a sense of responsibility and purpose. Her people needed her. Mordecai's words echoed in her heart, a refrain she could not ignore. For such a time as this, when she sent Hathach back to Mordecai, her tone had shifted. Gone was the hesitance, replaced by determination. She asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa and instruct them to fast for 3 days and nights. She, too, would fast, seeking strength and guidance from God. At the end of the fast, she would approach the king, knowing full well the danger. "If I perish, she declared, her voice steady. Mordecai received her message with a mix of relief and pride. His heart swelled at Esther's courage, even as he prayed for her safety. The news spread quickly among the Jewish community, and households began preparing for the fast. Together, they sought God's intervention, lifting their voices in prayer and placing their hope in his hands. Back in the palace, Esther spent those 3 days in quiet preparation. Her once busy chambers were now a sanctuary of reflection and prayer. She set aside the trappings of royalty, focusing instead on the inner strength she would need for the task ahead. As the final night of the fast approached, a calm settled over her. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve. The time was drawing near. Esther stood at the threshold of a moment that would define her legacy, a moment where faith and courage intertwined. Outside, the city of Susa lay in uneasy silence, the people waiting and praying. Inside, the queen took a deep breath, ready to step into the unknown. And so the stage was set. Esther's decision marked the beginning of a courageous journey, one that would test her faith and fortitude in ways she could not yet imagine. As the first light of dawn began to touch the city, the queen prepared herself to face the king, unaware of how her actions would ripple across the empire. Chapter 4: Esther's Brave Decision. The palace was still, its grand corridors bathed in the faint glow of twilight. Esther sat alone in her chambers, her thoughts a river of uncertainty and resolve. The last 3 days had been transformative, a time of fasting, reflection, and deep prayer. In the stillness, she had poured her fears and hopes into the hands of God, seeking guidance for the daunting task ahead. Now, as the final hours of the fast came to an end, a quiet strength began to take root within her. Though the weight of her decision loomed large, Esther's heart was steady. She had decided to approach the king, fully aware of the risks. The law was clear. To appear before the king uninvited was to gamble one's life. Yet her people needed her, and she could not let fear dictate her actions. "If I perish, she had told Mordecai. The words echoed in her mind, both a resignation and a declaration of faith. She rose, her movements deliberate as she prepared for the day ahead. Her attendants, sensing the gravity of the moment, worked in hushed silence. Esther chose her garments carefully, selecting a robe of royal purple, a color that symbolized both her authority as queen and the boldness of her purpose. She adorned herself with jewels that sparkled like the morning stars, their brilliance a testament to the dignity of her cause. As the final touch, she placed a simple yet elegant crown upon her head, a symbol of her unique position and the divine purpose she now embraced. As she looked into the polished bronze mirror, Esther saw more than her reflection. She saw the culmination of her journey, a young woman who had risen from obscurity to the heart of the Persian Empire, now standing on the brink of a moment that would define her legacy. With a deep breath, she turned to leave, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast halls of the palace. The path to the king's throne room seemed endless, each step heavy with anticipation. Courtiers and servants paused as she passed, their eyes widening in surprise. None dared to speak, but the tension in the air was palpable. They all knew the stakes, and whispers of Esther's boldness would soon ripple through the palace. At last, Esther reached the entrance to the throne room. The great doors loomed before her, their intricate carvings telling tales of Persian triumphs and power. Beyond them, the king sat upon his golden throne, surrounded by advisors and guards. Esther hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, asking for courage and favor. When the doors opened, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Esther as she stepped forward, her head held high, her posture regal yet humble. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to frame her in a golden halo, casting an almost ethereal glow. She walked slowly, each step measured, until she stood at the threshold of the king's presence. King Xerxes looked up, his expression unreadable. The court held its breath, waiting to see what the king would do. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the silence heavier than the ornate tapestries that lined the walls. Then, the king extended his golden scepter toward her, a gesture that sent a wave of relief through the room. Esther's gamble had paid off, her life was spared. Esther approached, her heart swelling with gratitude and resolve. She reached out to touch the tip of the scepter, a gesture of respect and submission. The king's voice broke the silence, his tone curious yet warm. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Though the king's words were generous, Esther knew the importance of timing. Her request was no ordinary one, and she needed to proceed with wisdom. With grace and composure, she replied, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." The king raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her invitation. He nodded in agreement, and messengers were dispatched to summon Haman. The stage was set, but Esther's task was far from over. The banquet would be her opportunity to speak, but for now, she returned to her chambers, her heart both relieved and anxious. As the day unfolded, news of the queen's bold approach spread through the palace and beyond. Among the Jewish community, there was a renewed sense of hope. Mordecai, hearing of Esther's success in gaining an audience with the king, offered prayers of thanksgiving. Yet he, too, understood the delicate balance of the situation. Esther had taken the first step, but the danger was far from over. In contrast, Haman's mood was one of pride and satisfaction. Being invited to a private banquet with the king and queen was a rare honor, one that fed his already inflated ego. He did not suspect that Esther's invitation was anything more than a gesture of royal favor. To him, it was further confirmation of his rising power and influence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the palace began to prepare for the evening's banquet. Esther, alone in her chambers, took a moment to steady herself. She knew the path ahead would require all her wisdom and courage. The banquet was only the beginning, a step toward revealing the truth and protecting her people. The chapter of Esther's brave decision was not one of resolution but of preparation. The queen had stepped forward in faith, trusting in God's guidance and the strength she had cultivated through prayer and fasting. As the night approached, the palace hummed with activity, and the next stage of Esther's plan began to unfold. In the quiet of her heart, Esther held tightly to the hope that her actions, though fraught with risk, would lead to deliverance for her people. Chapter 5: The King's Favor. The evening of the banquet arrived with a golden sunset spreading across the palace gardens, casting long shadows and painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. Within the palace walls, an air of anticipation hung heavy. Courtiers whispered among themselves about Queen Esther's bold invitation to both the king and his trusted advisor, Haman. It was a gathering of mystery, for none could guess what purpose lay behind her request. The grand banquet hall shimmered with opulence. Silken drapes in rich shades of crimson and gold adorned the walls, and the tables were laden with delicacies. Fragrant incense filled the air, mingling with the soft strains of harp music that drifted from a corner of the room. Esther, radiant yet composed, stood ready to greet her guests. Her gown, a flowing masterpiece of deep blue embroidered with silver thread, complemented the quiet confidence in her eyes. She had spent the hours before the feast in silent prayer, her resolve bolstered by her unwavering faith. When the king entered the hall, all eyes turned toward him. His presence was commanding, his robes shimmering with threads of gold. Behind him followed Haman, his expression one of smug satisfaction. To be included in such an intimate gathering was a rare honor, and Haman's ego swelled with the recognition. He believed this banquet was another affirmation of his rising status in the kingdom. As the meal began, the atmosphere was light and convivial. Esther's demeanor was warm and inviting, her conversation tactful and engaging. She served wine to the king and Haman, ensuring their cups were never empty. The king, clearly charmed by his queen, leaned back in his chair and smiled. "What is it you desire, Queen Esther?" he asked. "You have prepared such a splendid feast. Surely you did not summon us here without purpose. Speak your request, and it shall be granted, even up to half my kingdom." Esther met the king's gaze, her expression serene but thoughtful. She had waited for this moment, but her intuition told her the time to reveal her true purpose had not yet come. With graceful humility, she replied, "If I have found favor in your eyes, your majesty, and if it pleases you, may the king and Haman join me again tomorrow for another banquet I shall prepare. Then I will answer your question." The king nodded, intrigued. Haman, his pride swelling further, eagerly agreed. To be invited twice to the queen's private feasts was an honor he had never anticipated, and it filled him with a sense of triumph. As the evening drew to a close, the guests departed, leaving Esther to her thoughts. She knew the path ahead would require courage and precision, but she trusted that God was guiding her steps. Haman left the palace in high spirits, his heart brimming with arrogance. Yet, as he passed through the gates, his mood darkened. There stood Mordecai, unmoving and unbowed. The sight of Mordecai's quiet defiance ignited a fury within Haman. How dare this man, this Jew, show such insolence? Haman's pride, already inflated by his perceived importance, could not tolerate such an affront. Consumed by rage, Haman returned to his home and gathered his family and friends. As they dined, he boasted of his wealth, his many sons, and his rising favor with the king and queen. "Even Queen Esther," he declared, "has invited no one but me to accompany the king to her banquet. And again tomorrow, I am summoned to dine with them. Is this not proof of my greatness?" Yet even as he spoke, his thoughts turned bitter. "But all of this means nothing to me," he continued, "as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate." His companions, eager to flatter him, suggested a plan. Have a gallows built 75 feet high. In the morning, ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to the banquet and enjoy yourself. The idea pleased Haman, and he ordered the gallows to be constructed that very night. Meanwhile, within the palace, the king lay restless upon his bed. Sleep eluded him, and he called for the royal chronicles to be read aloud, hoping their dull recounting of court affairs would lull him into slumber. As the servant read, a particular entry caught the king's attention: the account of Mordecai's discovery of the plot to assassinate him. "What honor or recognition has been given to Mordecai for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," the servant replied. The king frowned, troubled by the oversight. As dawn broke, he resolved to correct this mistake. Just as he was considering how to honor Mordecai, Haman arrived in the outer court, eager to request permission to execute his nemesis. The king, unaware of Haman's intentions, summoned him at once. Haman entered, his face alight with anticipation. But before he could speak, the king posed a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Believing the king must be referring to him, Haman's mind raced with grandiose ideas. For the man the king delights to honor, he began, let a royal robe the king has worn be brought, along with a horse the king has ridden, one adorned with a royal crest. Let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, so that they may lead the man the king honors through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" The king nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Go at once and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Haman's heart sank, but he could not refuse the king's command. With a heavy heart, he carried out the task, leading Mordecai through the streets of Susa while proclaiming his honor. The humiliation was unbearable, and by the time the procession ended, Haman returned home in shame and despair. His family, sensing the tide turning against him, offered little comfort. They warned him that his opposition to Mordecai, a man of Jewish heritage, would bring about his downfall. Before Haman could fully process their words, messengers arrived to escort him to Esther's second banquet. As the sun set and the palace prepared for another lavish feast, the pieces of Esther's plan were falling into place. She knew the moment to act was drawing near, and her heart was steady with faith. The king's favor, the humiliation of Haman, and the unseen hand of divine providence were aligning in ways only God could orchestrate. The night ahead would be pivotal, a turning point in the story of Esther's courage and the deliverance of her people. Chapter 6. Haman's Downfall. The air was heavy with anticipation as the second banquet prepared by Queen Esther began. The grand hall, lit with golden lamps, shimmered with opulence. The king reclined at his place, with Haman seated nearby, his once confident demeanor now marked by an undercurrent of unease. Esther, calm yet resolute, carried the weight of a people's survival within her heart. As the servants laid out the feast, a sense of expectancy hung in the room. The king, ever fond of his new queen, broke the tension. "What is your request, Queen Esther? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther's heart raced, but her face remained serene. She knew this moment was divinely orchestrated. Taking a steady breath, she rose and addressed the king. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my request. And spare my people. This is my petition." The king straightened, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "Your life? Your people? What do you mean?" His voice, though calm, carried an edge of concern. Esther's gaze didn't waver. "For my people and I have been sold to destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I would have remained silent, for no such distress would justify disturbing the king." The room fell silent. The weight of her words sank in, and the king's brow furrowed in confusion. "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" he demanded, his tone growing darker. Esther's finger trembled slightly as she extended it towards Haman, who sat frozen in disbelief. "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The king's fury erupted. He rose abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor as it fell back. Haman, his face pale and his body trembling, couldn't muster a word. He knew his time had run out. The king stormed out into the palace garden, pacing under the night sky, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger and betrayal. How could one so close to him plot such evil, threatening not only the queen but an entire people? Inside, Haman collapsed at Esther's feet. "Queen Esther, I beg you, please spare my life," he pleaded, his once arrogant tone replaced by desperation. He grasped the edge of her garment, his panic rising as he saw the fury in her eyes, a quiet, righteous anger that spoke of justice. The king re-entered just as Haman threw himself onto the couch where Esther was reclining. Misinterpreting the scene, his rage deepened. "Will he even assault the queen while she is with me in the house?" he thundered. At that moment, Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, stepped forward. A gallows, 75 feet tall, stands by Haman's house. He had it built for Mordecai, the man who saved the king's life. The king's jaw tightened, and his decision was swift. "Hang him on it," he ordered. Haman's cries filled the room as the guards seized him. Esther watched in silence, her heart a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, But the struggle was far from over. Her people's lives still hung in the balance, and the law decreed by Haman remained in effect. As the commotion subsided, the gallows cast its long shadow in the moonlight, a stark reminder of how pride and malice could lead to one's downfall. Esther sat in her chambers that night, her thoughts a whirlwind. She prayed quietly, her words of gratitude interwoven with pleas for continued guidance. The courage she had shown was not her own. She knew she had been strengthened by God's hand. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Mordecai stood, his head bowed as he too reflected on the day's events. Though justice had been served, he knew the fight was not yet over. The king's decree, signed with his ring, was irrevocable. It still authorized the destruction of their people on the appointed day. Yet, as the morning sun rose, there was a glimmer of hope. Esther's bravery had turned the tide, and now a new path could be forged. The following morning, the palace buzzed with the news of Haman's downfall. Servants whispered in the corridors, and the courtiers speculated about what would happen next. Esther, however, knew there was no time to rest. The battle for her people's survival was far from complete. Summoning her strength once more, she prepared herself to approach the king with another bold request. This time, it wasn't about exposing a villain. It was about rewriting the fate of her people. The king, softened by Esther's courage and moved by her plight, would soon hear her next petition. But for now, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, the echoes of the past day's events lingering in every corner. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter of Esther's extraordinary journey, a story of faith, courage, and the unfailing provision of God, even in the face of impossible odds. Chapter 7. The King's New Decree. The days following Esther's bold revelation were filled with both tension and anticipation. The entire palace seemed to hum with energy, as whispers of what had occurred in the royal court spread quickly among the servants and those close to the king. The banquet had been a turning point, but the repercussions of Esther's actions were still unfolding. It was as if a veil of darkness had been lifted, and the heavy weight that had settled over the Jewish people now seemed to tremble with hope. Esther had risked her life to stand up for her people, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived for Haman. Yet what would the king decide? How would he respond to the wickedness that had been laid bare before him? In the quiet of the palace, King Xerxes sat on his royal throne, his mind swirling. The anger that had surged through him upon hearing Esther's revelation had not subsided. His fury at Haman was palpable, yet he knew that there was a bigger picture at stake. His queen, the woman he had chosen, had now opened his eyes to the treacherous plot that threatened the very people who had supported him in his reign. His thoughts lingered on Esther's courage, her bravery in revealing the truth. He had come to admire her for the quiet strength she had shown, even in the face of danger. But more than that, he understood now that there was a debt to be paid, and he was the one who had the power to right the wrongs that had been set in motion. The weight of this responsibility bore heavily on the king's shoulders as he summoned his royal scribes to his chambers. Word spread quickly, and soon the court gathered to witness the king's judgment. Haman, who had once walked with pride, was now in a place of shame. His arrogance had brought him to this very moment, and though he tried to protest, the king's decision was swift and unrelenting. Haman had been exposed, and justice, though delayed, was finally within reach. But even as the king turned his fury toward Haman, his mind turned to the Jewish people. The decree that Haman had signed, a decree that was now set in stone and could not be easily undone, still hung over them like a shadow. The king understood this. Though Haman would face the consequences of his actions, what about the fate of Esther's people? The decree could not simply be forgotten. The harm had been done, and the fear that had gripped the hearts of the Jews still lingered. King Xerxes, though moved by Esther's bravery, found himself caught in the intricacies of Persian law. Once a decree was signed by the king, it could not be revoked. The laws of the land were absolute, and to change one meant to unsettle the very foundation of the kingdom itself. Yet, in that moment, as he looked to his queen and saw the deep sorrow in her eyes, something stirred in his heart. A king's power was not only to impose laws, but also to show mercy and to heal wounds. He could not undo the past, but he could write a new decree that would allow the Jewish people to defend themselves. And so, with a heavy but resolute heart, King Xerxes made a bold decision. He ordered that a new decree be written, a decree that would allow the Jews to gather together and protect themselves. In a kingdom where fear had once taken root, the king now sought to replace it with a promise of safety. The sorrow that had swept through the land was about to be replaced with a newfound hope. The scribes worked quickly, writing the king's command. The words would be carried to every province of the vast empire, reaching far and wide, from the opulent halls of the royal palace to the humble homes of the Jewish people. The decree was clear. The Jews would be permitted to stand against any who would come to harm them, and they could defend themselves with strength, courage, and unity. No longer would they be helpless, waiting for a fate they could not control. They now had the right to protect their families and their lives. Esther, who had been anxiously waiting to hear the king's decision, felt a sense of relief wash over her as the royal decree was read aloud in the court. She knew that her people, who had been in such despair, would now have a chance to fight back, to survive and to flourish once again. Her heart swelled with a quiet sense of joy, knowing that the fear that had held her people in its grip for so long was finally being replaced by a sense of empowerment. Though the danger was not over, the first steps toward salvation had been taken. But even in this moment of victory, Esther knew that it wasn't just the decree itself that had brought about this shift, but the hand of God, guiding and protecting them all along. She had taken a bold step, risking her life to approach the king, and now she saw the fruit of her faith and courage. God had provided a way where there seemed to be no way, and the lives of her people had been spared. As news of the king's new decree spread across the land, the mood shifted dramatically. The Jewish people, once trembling in fear, began to celebrate the hope that had been restored to them. They could now face the future with confidence, knowing that they had the power to defend themselves. Where once there had been sorrow, there was now a stirring of joy and celebration. The Jewish communities across the empire gathered together in quiet excitement, sharing the good news with one another. It was as if the heavy clouds that had hung over them for so long had finally begun to part, and they could once again see the light of hope shining through. But Esther knew that their work was not finished. She had acted with courage, and the king had granted them the chance to defend themselves. But there was still much to be done. The feast of celebration could wait. There were preparations to be made, plans to be set into motion. The Jewish people had to come together as one, prepared for the day when the decree would be carried out. Their unity and strength would be the key to their survival. In her heart, Esther held onto the peace that had settled over her, knowing that she had played a part in this deliverance, that she had obeyed the calling placed upon her life. God had worked through her to save a nation, and the courage she had found in the face of fear would forever stand as a testament to his provision and love. As she looked to the future, Esther's heart was filled with gratitude. But she also knew that her people's journey was not yet complete. The days ahead would bring their own challenges. But for now, Esther allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had made her stand. The king's new decree had been given. Hope had been restored. And with it, Esther and her people could now face the future with confidence and faith, knowing that God was with them every step of the way. The story of their salvation was not yet over, but it had taken a mighty turn, one that would echo through the ages as a reminder of the power of courage, faith, and the unwavering love of God. Chapter 8. A Legacy of Courage. The days following the king's new decree were filled with a quiet but resolute determination. The Jewish people, once filled with fear, were now filled with hope. Word had spread across the land, from the royal palace to the smallest villages, that the king had issued a decree allowing them to defend themselves. The shadow of fear that had hung over the Jewish community was lifting, and in its place was a powerful sense of unity, strength, and gratitude. Yet, the full weight of what had happened, the courage, the intervention, the unexpected reversal of fate, was still settling into the hearts of all who had witnessed or been touched by it. It was not just Esther's bravery that had made the difference. It was the deep, unshakable faith that she had placed in God. Her actions had been bold, yes, but they were also a testament to her trust in the one who had called her to such a time as this. She had stepped out in courage, not knowing how it would end, but believing that God would provide the way. As Esther reflected on everything that had unfolded, she knew that the story of their deliverance was not just a personal story of triumph, but a story of God's faithfulness to his people. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, when all seemed lost, God was working behind the scenes. From the moment that Esther had been chosen to be queen, to the tense days when Mordecai had urged her to intercede on behalf of their people, to the moment of Esther's brave decision to risk her life by approaching the king, each moment had been part of a larger plan. It was as if everything in her life had been leading up to this pivotal point. The story of Esther's courage would not be forgotten. As the days passed and the Jewish people began to prepare for the day when they would finally be able to defend themselves, a sense of celebration began to fill the air. It was not just the promise of safety that brought hope, but the deep realization that God had provided for them. They had been rescued, not through their own strength, but through the courage of one woman who had trusted in God's plan. In the years that followed, the Jewish people would gather to remember this great act of deliverance. They established a new festival, a festival of joy and remembrance, known as Purim. Every year, the Jewish communities would celebrate the victory that God had brought through Esther's courage. It became a time of feasting, of giving, and of joy. They would read the story of Esther aloud, recounting the events that had led to their salvation and giving thanks to God for his faithfulness. The festival was a time to reflect on the incredible courage of one woman, whose decision to act had saved an entire people. Purim was more than just a celebration of Esther's bravery. It was a celebration of God's provision and protection. It was a way for the Jewish people to acknowledge that, despite the challenges they had faced, God had always been with them. It was a reminder that even when they could not see the full picture, God was working behind the scenes, weaving together the threads of their lives for a greater purpose. As the years passed, the festival of Purim became one of the most beloved celebrations in the Jewish calendar. Families would gather together, sharing meals and laughter, and remembering the story of how God had saved them. They would dress in costumes, symbolizing the hidden nature of God's providence in their lives, and they would give gifts to one another, just as Esther had given to her people. It was a time of unity and joy, a time to reflect on the blessings they had received and to share with those in need. But the legacy of Esther's courage went beyond the annual celebration. It was a legacy that touched the hearts of every generation that came after her. Her story was passed down from parent to child, from generation to generation, as a reminder that one person's courage could change the course of history. The story of Esther was not just a story of a queen who saved her people. It was a story of faith in action. It was a story of trust, of stepping out in faith when the odds seemed insurmountable, and of believing that God could use anyone, no matter their position or status, to accomplish his purposes. Esther's courage was also a reminder that God's timing is perfect. She had been chosen as queen at a time when her people needed her most. Though she had faced moments of fear and uncertainty, she had been faithful to the task God had set before her. And in the end, her obedience to God's calling had brought about a deliverance that none could have predicted. Her story was a testament to the fact that no matter how difficult or impossible the situation may seem, God's plan will always prevail. In her heart, Esther knew that her courage had come from a place of deep trust in God. She had not acted out of her own strength, but out of her belief that God would be with her every step of the way. She had taken a step into the unknown, not knowing what the future would hold, but believing that God would guide her. And in the end, her faith had been rewarded. She had seen the deliverance of her people, and she had experienced firsthand the power of God's provision. As Esther's story spread throughout the land, it became a beacon of hope for those who faced their own challenges. Her courage inspired others to take bold steps of faith, to stand up for what was right, and to trust that God would provide, even when the way seemed uncertain. Her story reminded the Jewish people, and all who heard it, that courage, faith, and obedience to God could change the world. And so, the legacy of Esther lived on, not only in the celebration of Purim, but in the hearts and lives of all who heard her story. It was a legacy that would never be forgotten, a legacy that would continue to inspire and encourage for generations to come. Esther had shown the world that no matter how small or insignificant one might seem, God could use them to do great things. Her story was a reminder that, with God's help, even the most unlikely of heroes could change the course of history. As we reflect on Esther's bravery, let us remember that courage and faith are not always about grand gestures or dramatic acts. Sometimes they are about standing firm in the face of fear, trusting in God when the outcome is unknown, and being willing to take a step into the unknown for the sake of others. Esther's legacy is one of hope, of faith in God's provision, and of the powerful impact that one person's courage can have on the world. Her story reminds us that, no matter the odds, God is always with us, and He can use us to bring about His purposes in ways we cannot even imagine. As the Jewish people continued to celebrate Purim, they did so with hearts full of gratitude, knowing that Esther's courage had been the instrument through which their salvation had come. And through the ages, her story would be told, and her legacy would endure as a shining example of what it means to trust in God, to act with courage, and to believe that He is always with us, even in the darkest of times. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful journey through the story of Queen Esther. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and consider subscribing to our channel to join our community and for more videos like this. Now I wish you a peaceful and blessed sleep, and I'll see you on the next video. May God bless you.